Have you ever wondered what the world would be like if history took a different turn? Imagine a world where the vibrant Islamic Golden Age, a period of immense scientific, cultural, and economic flourishing, never ended. What if the centers of learning in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba continued to be the world's leading hubs of innovation for centuries more? How different would our lives be today? Would our technology be more advanced? Would our societies be structured differently? Let us dive into this fascinating alternate history and explore a world where the flame of the Islamic Golden Age never dimmed. For roughly 5 centuries, from the 8th to the 13th, the Islamic world was a powerhouse of intellectual and cultural achievement. While Europe was navigating the early Middle Ages, scholars in cities like Baghdad were translating and building upon the works of Greek, Indian, and Persian thinkers. They made groundbreaking advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. But in the 13th century, a series of events, most notably the Mongol invasion and the destruction of Baghdad, brought this era to a devastating halt. The Great House of Wisdom, a legendary library and intellectual center, was destroyed. Countless books and a wealth of knowledge were lost forever. So, what if that never happened? What if the Mongols were repelled, or if their conquest took a different, less destructive path? What if the internal political fractures that weakened the Caliphates were healed? This isn't just a question of preserving knowledge. It's about what that knowledge would have become. We're talking about a continuous, unbroken chain of progress stretching from the 9th century to the modern day. This alternate reality would reshape everything we know about our world, from the maps on our walls to the very way we think. Let's start with the political landscape. In our timeline, the decline of the Islamic Golden Age paved the way for the rise of European powers. The Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, and the colonial era were all fueled by knowledge that, in many cases, had been preserved and advanced by Islamic scholars. But in a world where the Islamic Caliphates remained strong, unified, and technologically superior, history would look very different. Instead of European colonial empires spanning the globe, we might see powerful, expansive caliphates or sultanates. These wouldn't necessarily be empires of conquest in the way we picture them. Their influence could have spread through trade, culture, and scientific prestige, creating a vast network of interconnected states centered around hubs like Baghdad or a rebuilt, even grander Damascus. The balance of global power would be completely redrawn. The Americas might have been discovered not by Spanish explorers, but by Arab or Persian navigators using advanced astrolabes and sailing techniques perfected over centuries. Instead of the Treaty of Tordesillas dividing the world between Spain and Portugal, we might have seen treaties brokered in Cairo or Isfahan, carving out spheres of influence across the continents. Governance within these states might have evolved differently too. The emphasis on law, administration, and scholarly counsel, which was a hallmark of rulers like Harun al-Rashid, could have developed into sophisticated forms of constitutional monarchies or early republics. The concept of the nation-state, as we know it, born in Europe, might have been replaced by a more cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic model of statehood, bound together by a common language of scholarship, trade, and faith. European nations, in this timeline, might have remained a collection of smaller, competing kingdoms, looking eastward not as a territory to conquer, but as the source of power and progress they wished to emulate. The global dynamics would shift from a West-dominated world to one with a powerful, stable, and influential Middle Eastern core. The very idea of East and West might not carry the same political weight it does today. Now, let's talk about technology and science, because this is where things get truly mind-blowing. The Islamic Golden Age gave us algebra, the algorithm, and incredible advances in medicine and optics. The scientific method itself was being pioneered by figures like Ibn al-Haytham centuries before it was embraced in Europe. If this progress had continued without interruption, where would we be? Imagine a scientific revolution happening, not in 17th century Europe, but in the 14th century Middle East. The principles of calculus might have been developed hundreds of years earlier, accelerating everything that depends on it. Steam power, electricity, maybe even the basic principles of flight, could have been unlocked centuries ahead of schedule. We might have seen industrialization take root, not in Manchester, but in Mosul. Think about medicine. Physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina wrote encyclopedias that were the standard medical textbooks in Europe for centuries. They understood quarantine, the importance of hygiene, and performed complex surgeries. With another 500 years of uninterrupted research, it's possible that cures for diseases that plagued humanity for centuries could have been found much earlier. The germ theory of disease might have been established fact by the 1500s. Hospitals, which were already advanced, and secular institutions in the Islamic world would have become even more sophisticated centers of healing and research. And what about astronomy? Observatories in the Islamic world were state-of-the-art, with massive instruments for charting the stars. Scholars were already questioning the Ptolemaic model of the universe. It's highly likely that a heliocentric, sun-centered model of the solar system would have been proven and accepted in Baghdad or Samarkand long before Copernicus. With this knowledge, space exploration might have begun centuries earlier. We could be looking at a world that established moon bases in the 19th century or sent probes to Mars in the early 20th. The digital age itself could have been born from the lineage of Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra. The algorithmic thinking that powers our computers today would have had a much longer, richer history to draw upon, potentially leading to a form of computation we can't even imagine. This scientific and technological dominance would naturally reshape society and culture. In a world where the intellectual center remains in the Middle East, cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Granada would be the global metropolises, drawing scholars, artists, and merchants from every corner of the earth. These would be true melting pots, far more diverse and cosmopolitan than any city in our timeline's medieval or Renaissance Europe. The values of intellectual curiosity, tolerance, and patronage of the arts and sciences would be seen as the cornerstones of a successful society. What about social structures? The Islamic Golden Age had a relatively high degree of social mobility, and while not a modern democracy, it had complex legal systems that granted rights to citizens. The role of women in this alternate history is particularly interesting. While it was still a patriarchal society, women in the Golden Age had rights to property, inheritance, and education that were often unheard of in contemporary Europe. With continued progress, we might have seen a much earlier movement for women's rights and greater participation in public and intellectual life. Culturally, the influence would be immense. Arabic would likely be the global language of science and diplomacy, much like English is today. Architectural styles, blending Persian, Byzantine, and Arab aesthetics would influence buildings worldwide. The art, music, and literature of the Islamic world would be the dominant global culture. Imagine a world where the epic poems of Rumi or the tales of 1001 Nights are as foundational to global culture as Shakespeare. Religious tolerance, a notable feature of many Golden Age societies like in Al-Andalus, could have become a more deeply embedded global norm. The constant exchange of ideas between Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars might have led to centuries of philosophical and theological dialogue, fostering a world with a more nuanced and less confrontational relationship between the great faiths. Daily life for the average person would be transformed, with access to public hospitals, libraries, and potentially even public transport centuries earlier than in our timeline. So what are the global consequences of this unbroken golden age? The world would be a fundamentally different place. The age of European colonialism might never have happened, meaning the histories of Africa, Asia, and the Americas would be entirely unrecognizable. Many indigenous cultures that were decimated by colonial expansion could have survived and thrived, perhaps engaging with the powerful Islamic states as trading partners or autonomous allies. The very concept of race and the hierarchies built around it, which were largely constructs of the colonial era, might not exist in the same way. The world would likely be more interconnected, but with a center of gravity firmly planted in the Middle East. However, this doesn't mean it would be a utopia. Power corrupts, and a dominant civilization, no matter how enlightened, would face its own challenges. There would still be wars, political rivalries, and internal conflicts. Perhaps new ideologies would arise to challenge the status quo. Maybe scientific progress would lead to weapons far more destructive than anything we saw in our own world's early modern period. A powerful, technologically advanced caliphate might become expansionist and hegemonic in its own right, creating new forms of oppression. There's no guarantee of a perfect world, but it would be a world with a completely different set of problems and possibilities. The great debates of our time about globalization, secularism, and tradition would be framed in a completely different context, shaped by centuries of Islamic intellectual leadership rather than European enlightenment. In summary, If the Islamic Golden Age had never ended, we would be living in a world turned on its head. Our political maps, our technological capabilities, our cultural norms, and even our core beliefs would be profoundly different. We might be centuries ahead in some areas, like medicine or astronomy, but perhaps we'd face social and ethical dilemmas we can't even fathom. It's a world where the main currents of history flowed from the Tigris and the Nile instead of the Thames and the Seine. This alternate reality serves as a powerful reminder that our present was never inevitable. History is full of turning points, moments where everything could have changed. The fall of Baghdad was one of them, a catastrophic loss of knowledge and potential. It makes you wonder, what other golden ages have been lost to time, and what worlds could have been? What do you think would be the biggest difference in a world where the Golden Age never ended? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through an alternate history. If you found this as fascinating as I did, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more explorations into the what-ifs of history, and definitely share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your theories on how this world would look. Until next time, keep asking questions.